Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. Welcome to part 2 of Penn BLSA's Breaking the Chain of Oppression, Comprehensive Reparations series. Penn BLSA would like to thank our panelists, Professor Thomas Craemer and Professor Dania V. Francis, for joining us. We would also like to thank the Toll Public Interest Center for co-sponsoring this event and Penn Law for its support in making this event possible. My name is Magali Duque. I'm currently a 2L and I am the co-chair of BLSA's PANAF Pro Bono Trip. Before introducing our panel, I'm going to briefly introduce my co-moderator for this evening, who I'd like to thank for organizing this series, Jocelyn Walcott. Jocelyn will be moderating the audience Q&A portion of this evening and would like to share a few words before we begin.
Thank you all so much for joining, and of course, thank you to our panelists. We have a really engaging discussion plan for tonight. Feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function, and our panelists will address them at the end of the program. Thank you, Magali.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So to situate us all in preparation for tonight's panel, I'd like to share a few words about what brings us here. The structural oppression and inequality that began with slavery has continuously evolved and still persists today. Currently, the Black-white wealth gap is now times 10, representing the widest racial wealth gap in the US. Understanding the economics of reparations is therefore an important and key component in this conversation about reparations. In 2016, a United Nations working group concluded that the colonial history, legacy of enslavement, racial subordination, segregation, racial terrorism, and racial inequality in the United States remains a serious challenge, as there has been no real commitment to reparations nor to truth and reconciliation for people of African descent. The UN working group encouraged the US Congress to pass H.R. 40. If passed, H.R. 40 would establish a commission to examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the US from 1619 to the present, as well as recommend appropriate remedies. There have since been several hearings on H.R. 40. While waiting for Congress to vote on the bill, this year's PANAF Pro Bono group, along with expert advice from our faculty advisor, Professor Austin, engaged in drafting model reparations legislation and a cross-comparative research project with the Haitian Lawyers Association to broaden our understanding of how other groups within the diaspora have approached retribution for slavery. This work is a continuation of last year's PANAF trip to Brazil, where we engage with local stakeholders and lawyers involved in the Brazilian reparations movement. Tonight, our panel will focus on the economics and implementation of reparations. I will introduce each panelist before their 15-minute presentations. Then we will have a discussion with our two experts and conclude with a Q&A session. Just as a reminder, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. And although our panelists will answer questions after the presentations, you can submit questions throughout the program. Professor Craemer will start off the panel. It is my honor to introduce Professor Thomas Craemer. He obtained a political science doctorate in 2001, from the University of Tübingen in his native country, Germany, and a PhD from Stony Brook University, New York in 2005. He currently teaches at the University of Connecticut's Department of Public Policy. His experience of growing up in post-World War II Germany motivated his research on implicit racial attitudes and race-related policies, including slavery reparations. In 2015, he published an article titled Estimating Slavery Reparations that has been widely cited in the media, including appearances in Full Frontal with Samantha Bee and United Shades of America with W. Kwame Bell. He has presented at reparations conferences in Gambia, South Africa, and at Tulane Law School. The floor is yours, Professor Craemer.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I will start my presentation, just working the technology. Just one second. All right, can you see the screen? Yes, great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this amazing event. I really look forward to the discussion. My presentation is entitled U.S. Slavery Reparations as Part of a Comprehensive Reparations Program. And what I would like to do is first give you a brief introduction into my motivation to do this research, then an overview of U.S. slavery reparations proposals since the beginning of the country. and some precedents for slavery reparations, although I have to warn everybody that this is very frustrating because these precedents all were reparations to slave owners and their heirs, not to the enslaved and their descendants. Then I'll present 3 different methods of how to estimate US slavery reparations and draw my conclusions. As Magali already said, I was born in post-World War II Germany and raised in this picturesque town of Tübingen, very beautiful. But in growing up, in every high school subject, I learned about the Holocaust. And I always felt ashamed, intensely ashamed about our history. And I always wished to be able to express to a Holocaust survivor how I felt. But of course, I never thought I would have the opportunity. Until one day I met Mieczysław Langer, a survivor of 5 concentration camps and a death march in his teenage years. And in his retirement, he relocated from Israel to, of all places, Tübingen, Germany, in my hometown. And this is where our 2 families met. And then we undertook a spiritual journey to Poland, to the concentration camp memorial sites where he lost his entire family to commemorate. Here's a picture of his grandson, David, and Mieczysław himself at the Płażów concentration camp memorial site in Poland. During the trip, we learned about the intense, horrific experiences that he underwent as a young man. And so I always wondered, how was it possible that someone like Mieczysław was ever able to regain trust in Germans or in Germany as a country after the suffering he went through in his teenage years? So I don't want to take anything away from his amazing humanity, but what certainly didn't hurt is, as I learned after he passed away, that he received a reparations pension first from the West German government and later from the government of reunited Germany from the 1970s on to 2015 of about $2,000 per month in 2018 dollars. Not very much, clearly not enough. And actually, there is no monetary equivalent that could ever make up for his losses. So it's definitely just a symbolic gesture. But in my view, it's an important gesture. What I learned from this experience is reparations cannot undo the damage. The damage is done, but they can make words of apology more meaningful. And I think that's a major reason why they should be implemented. Now, US slavery reparations have been debated from the beginning of the country, and the earliest example that I could find go back to George Washington, here pictured with his slave Billy Lee, who accompanied him throughout the Revolutionary War. And Lee was freed by Washington's will, along with all the other slaves that Washington held in his own name. And here is Washington's handwriting in his will. He stated, "It is my will and desire that all the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom, seeing that a regular and permanent fund be established for their support, so long as there are subjects requiring it." This fund was actually paid out, and the enslaved received the money that Washington dedicated in his will. And George Washington's will was also widely circulated in the newspapers of the day. And it was his hope that it would set an example for the voluntary abolition of slavery. This was a naive idea. Obviously, it didn't happen. But what I find remarkable is that this is the first proposal that the enslaved should receive a fund, not the enslavers. All other proposals at the time saw compensated emancipation with compensation for the slave owners. Later, 40 acres and a mule emerged from General Sherman's field order number 15 in 1865 as a Civil War measure, whereby confiscated Confederate land was distributed in 40-acre parcels to 40,000 freedmen and women until President Andrew Johnson returned the land to the former slave owners. Representative Thaddeus Stevens tried to implement a reparations bill calling for 40 acres and a mule, but it failed in 1866 or 1867. But the memory of 40 acres and a mule remained active in African-American collective memory. And these proposals inspired land-based reparations for the next century and a half. For example, Sojourner Truth in 1870 demanded land for reparations. Queen Mother Moore was an important reparations activist in the 20th century. Dempsey Travis in 1970 designed a new Homestead Act with the value of 40 acres and a mule. And most recently, Professor William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, authors of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, revived the idea of land-based reparations. Of course, there were other proposals too. For example, Kelly House in the late 19th century called for pensions for ex-slaves, and she was incarcerated for her efforts. Marcus Garvey called for reparations to Africa from Europe for colonial depredations. James Forman called for cash reparations from white Christian and Jewish congregations for their complicity in slavery. And economist Robert S. Brown demanded in 1974, quote, a transfer of a sizable chunk of America's wealth to the Black community. And I'll later on look at some estimation methods of how we can quantify that chunk. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which provided $20,000 per survivor to Japanese-American World War II internees, accompanied by a letter of apology from the US president. It's probably the most successful reparations program in the United States so far. In response, Representative John Conyers introduced House Bill H.R. 40 for the first time in 1989 and reintroduced it in every following House. It's now introduced by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. The bill itself does not provide for reparations, which I find a little controversial, but it provides for the formation of a commission to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. In 1990, Richard F. America published the book, The Wealth of Races, an edited volume where economists presented price-based reparations estimates that I will also talk about briefly later on. This was a groundbreaking work. And in 2014, Ta-Nehisi Coates published The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic, which basically launched the reparations debate from an inner African-American debate into the mainstream, and it has remained in the mainstream ever since. Now let me talk about these precedents for slavery reparations that I warned you about in the beginning. The most egregious example, in my view, is the so-called Haitian independence debt. Here are pictures of Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, two of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. Behind me on the wall is also a portrait of Toussaint Louverture. They abolished slavery permanently in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, later renamed it Haiti and made it an independent republic. And they abolished slavery also in Latin America by giving military aid to Simón Bolívar in his project to liberate Latin America from Spanish rule, under the condition that he abolished slavery there, which he did. In 1825, King Charles X of France sent a fleet demanding an indemnity from Haiti for the former slave owners who had fled to France. So compensation for the loss of their property. It was calculated to be 10 years worth of the Haitian government's entire revenue. And this crippling Haitian independence debt was financed through loans from French banks. And these loans were serviced from 1825 to 1947. So after World War II, the last payment was made after 122 years. So when people say it's too long ago, or, you know, here's an example of a reparations program that went centuries. Another example is the reparations to British slave owners. In 1833, the British government abolished slavery and took up loans and paid reparations to the slave owners. And these loans were serviced for 182 years, from 1833 to literally 2015. 6 years ago, it was finally paid off. Generations of British and immigrants were settled with a bill from slavery. So this is another example of something going on for centuries. In the United States as well, the slave owners were compensated in Washington, D.C. when the government abolished slavery there in 1862. $300 were paid to slave owners for each enslaved person. And there were 3,100 formerly enslaved that were liberated through this. So this amounts to what would have been $930,000, about 25 million in 2020 dollars. Again, at the height of the Civil War, when every single penny counted for the preservation of the Union, they still paid reparations. Many other countries also paid reparations to slave owners, for example, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Argentina, Colombia, Paraguay, Venezuela, Peru, Brazil, and the list goes on and on. It was never controversial as long as the beneficiaries were slave owners and their white heirs, rather than the formerly enslaved and their black heirs. So that's where the problem still is. Now, let me turn to estimating slavery reparations in the United States. In the book, The Wealth of Races, Professor Swinton proposed a comprehensive formula for reparations, counting all the losses from various forms of discrimination, ranging from lost income to lost freedom during slavery, lost opportunities to accumulate capital, as well as pain and suffering. And that during colonial slavery, during US slavery, and during post-slavery discrimination. From all these components are additive, and so the final outstanding amount would be humongous, but I'll just pick one of these elements and show how you can calculate that very, very, very conservatively. So lost income due to slavery during the US. There are three approaches that I already mentioned. One is land-based, the second is price-based, and the third one is wage-based. The land-based method uses the current value of 40 acres and a mule. The price-based method takes historical prices for enslaved people as expected return for a slave owner from owning a slave. That counts about the 12 daylight hours that the slaves are engaged in cash crop production. And then I proposed the wage-based method from the perspective of the enslaved, what they lost. They lost control over all 24 hours of the day and should be remunerated for all 24 hours. The land-based estimate that Professor Darity published in 2008 would amount to $2.978 trillion in 2018 dollars. The price-based one proposed by Marchetti in 2018 dollars would be $13.2 trillion, and my wage-based estimate would in 2018 dollars be 18.6 trillion. So they're all in the trillions range. And I'll give you one example of how I came up with a wage-based estimate. All I needed was an estimate of the number of enslaved people in each year from 1776 to 1860 from census records, and records of historical unskilled wages from 1776 to 1860. Again, I'm ignoring centuries of colonial slavery, not because they're not important, but because additional research would be required. And I'm ignoring the years from 1861 to 1865, the Civil War years, because the number of enslaved that were remaining is difficult to estimate during that time. Again, that makes the calculation very, very conservative. Here is a table of the US enslaved population from 1790 to 1860, based on the decennial US censuses. And I'm using linear interpolation between decennial censuses to get the annual population. And I use linear extrapolation for the years before 1790. Other more sophisticated methods could be used. And here is the production workers' hourly compensation in nominal dollars from 1790 to 1860. You see that the hourly wages were puny, ranging from 2 cents in 1790 to 8 cents in 1860. This again makes the calculation very conservative. I should also mention that many of the enslaved were skilled. So taking unskilled wages is again a conservative approach. And here's an excerpt of my Excel spreadsheet. The first column is the year. The second column is the estimated number of enslaved in that year. It's estimated if in italics, and it's bold print, meaning it's observed from the census. For the wages, the same, estimated is italics and bold print is observed. The hours per year that were available to slave owners is the number of enslaved times 365 days times 24 hours a day. And then I multiply that number with the wage and get the annual total that's outstanding. And because it is outstanding and was never paid, I compound it with a small interest rate of only 3% and add those up over the years from 1776 all the way to 1860. The list here is truncated at 1794, but of course it continues to 1860. And after that, I use this beautiful formula to compound it up to 2018 to arrive at an estimate at the conservative interest rate of 3%, which does not make up for inflation, of $18.58 trillion in 2018 dollars. For comparison purposes, in 2018, the US GDP was $20.89 trillion. So we're talking roughly 1 year's worth of the US GDP. That seems a humongous amount. And it's amazing that this humongous amount results from these small, puny hourly wages. But it's not infinite. It could be paid off. So in conclusion, the goal of reparations to African-American descendants of the enslaved, in my view, should be at a minimum closing the average per capita Black-white wealth gap, estimated in 2018 to be $352,250. So that's the minimum, in my view. The wage-based reparations at only 3% interest, super conservative, would comfortably close this wealth gap at $397,459 in 2018 dollars. Of course, as I showed with Swinton's formula earlier, other amounts are still outstanding and they're additive. So what was actually lost is much larger than what I propose here as one measure to close it. The proportion of the losses to be compensated should be negotiated, in my view, between the federal government and the descendant community. And the same is true for the modalities. And among modalities could be cash payments, as we saw with Japanese American World War II internees. It could be trust funds. It could be pensions, like the example of my friend Miechu, who received a pension. Then there could be health accounts, educational funds. There's a whole range of modalities. But again, they should be negotiated between the federal government and the descendant community. It's very important that the descendants be heard in this and that the government not make decisions above the heads of the descendants. My last word is cash reparations are the least popular in surveys, I find. Other modalities require administration by well-meaning Black or white administrators and thus, in my view, carry the risk of paternalistic racism. Cash payments avoid this risk and restore decision-making power to the rightful heirs of the enslaved. Therefore, I lean towards the latter. But again, this should be between the government and the descendant community. So with that, I say thank you very much. And I stop the share.
Professor Craemer, wow, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. To our audience, please remember, if you'd like to submit a question, please do so through the Q&A function. And now next is my honor to introduce Professor Dania Francis. Dr. Francis is an assistant professor of economics at UMass Boston. Her current research involves using experimental and quasi-experimental methods to identify structural causes of racial and socioeconomic academic achievement gaps. More broadly, Professor Francis's research interests include examining racial and socioeconomic disparities in education, wealth accumulation, and labor markets. She has been researching the issue of reparations for African Americans for over 18 years and is the co-author of an influential paper titled The Economics of Reparations in the American Economic Review. Dr. Francis received her doctorate from Duque University and also holds a master's degree from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree from Smith College. She is a board member of the National Economics Association and a National Academies of Education Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow. Dr. Francis has been featured on CNBC International and TRT World, and her work has been written about in several major publication outlets. Professor Francis, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for hosting this and for inviting me. It is an honor to be here. And I want to say thank you to Professor Craemer. That was very comprehensive. So I'll try to add some value, but I feel like you have done so much of the heavy lifting too. So, so thank you for that. So much of what I'll say today is drawn from a paper that I wrote for the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. So I would like to acknowledge them and encourage you to visit their webpage at equitablegrowth.org. However, all opinions are my own. So again, the idea of reparations for African Americans has received renewed attention, driven in part by the willingness of an unprecedented number of prominent politicians to engage in serious discussion on the topic. As was mentioned, you know, I've been studying this topic of reparations in my career for over 18 years, and even in that relatively short time frame over the course of the reparations discussion, I've seen ebbs and flows, right, in the conversation about reparations and the national interest. And so again, Professor Craemer did a very good job of discussing the history, so I won't go back through that. The only thing I'll add would be to add to the discussion of Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations, published in The Atlantic. The focus, the other thing he did besides, as Professor Craemer rightly suggested, bringing it so much more to the national attention, was also to help broaden the discussion of the basis for reparations to include the Jim Crow era, of state-sanctioned discrimination, the discriminatory federal, state, and local laws and policies and ordinances that were prevalent during the New Deal and post-World War II eras, as well as ongoing institutional racism in employment, education, and the criminal justice system. And so what I'll center my comments on are thinking about the logistics of carrying out a reparations program. And so by definition, right, reparations involve the making of amends to those who have been wronged, whether through money or by other means, right? And so key logistical questions that arise when conceptualizing reparations, excuse me, for African Americans include who should be eligible to receive reparations, how much money should be allocated to fund a reparations program, and how should it be financed, and what form should reparations take, right? So I'll take these in turn. So the first thought, thinking about who should be eligible. So one thought would be that eligibility for inclusion in a reparations program for African Americans in particular should accrue to those who have been wronged and or their descendants. Eligibility then would depend on the reason for redress, right? So reparations for slavery in America then should accrue to the descendants of those who were formerly enslaved in the United States, right? In that vein, then descendants of enslaved persons from other nations, such as Jamaica, Haiti, Brazil, right? There's the diaspora, who are currently living in the United States, would not be eligible under that eligibility guideline, but should instead seek reparations against the nations that were primarily responsible for enslavement in those regions. So policymakers will have to determine whether current US citizenship is a requirement for receiving reparations. And that's one of these open questions. Reparations for state-sanctioned discrimination during the Jim Crow, New Deal, and post-World War II eras should accrue to any African Americans who were living in the US during those time periods and or their descendants, regardless of whether their ancestors were enslaved in the US. Right? Black immigrants from the West Indies and Africa also faced state-sanctioned discrimination in the US during this period, even if they were voluntary immigrants to the US. Reparations for ongoing discrimination should accrue to any African Americans who have either self-identified or been identified as Black on an official document sometime prior to the passage of reparations legislation, right? And so it's important to note that regardless of how eligibility is crafted in reparations legislation, it may ultimately become a question before the courts, right? Take the example of Japanese American reparations. There were Japanese Peruvians who were interned alongside Japanese Americans during World War II, from Peru, taken from Peru and interned in US internment camps. During the discussion of reparations for Japanese Americans, Japanese Peruvians were not included. They were excluded, and eventually they filed a lawsuit to be included in reparations for Japanese Americans. They succeeded. However, their reparations payments were much lower than those that were given to Japanese Americans. I give that example to say, this is something that, regardless of the eligibility rules that might be set up, may be open to discussion in courts. Okay. The next question, thinking about how much, again, I thank Professor Craemer for covering a lot of this ground, right? Estimates that have been calculated in the past, mostly in the 1990s and early 2000s, range from 500 billion to 6 trillion. And now more recently, we have estimates from Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen, and also Professor Craemer, that are more along the lines of 10, 12, right, 18 trillion. And so if you divide these amounts evenly amongst the roughly 40 million people identified as Black or African American in the 2020 census, you can get a sense of somewhere between 12,500 to upwards of 450,000 per individual, right? The wide range arises from differences both in the calculation methods as well as in the underlying rationale for reparations. For example, if we're just including reparations for slavery versus including Jim Crow or ongoing discrimination. We saw an excellent example and also descriptions of other estimates from Professor Craemer. I'll elaborate on estimates that include discrimination during the Jim Crow, New Deal, and post-World War II eras, which are necessarily larger than those from only the area of the arena of slavery. So for example, if we think about Black land loss estimates, this includes estimated losses to the countless Black farmers who fell victim to violent dispossession of their land prior to the civil rights reforms of the 1960s, as well as those who lost land due to discriminatory federal farm credit policies and the discriminatory implementation of federal, state, and local agricultural policies before, during, and after the civil rights era. That would increase the estimate by hundreds of billions of dollars, right? William Darity and Kirsten Mullen argue in their comprehensive book, From Here to Equality, that the goal of a reparations payment should be to eliminate the current Black-white wealth gap, which they argue is the manifestation of the cumulative intergenerational economic impact of the history of anti-Black racism in the US. So data from the 2016 survey of consumer finances put the wealth gap between the average Black and white household at 800,000 per household. So summed across potentially eligible Black households, Darity and Mullen estimate a reparations program on the order of 10 to 12 trillion. Okay. What form should reparations payments take, right? A reparation program can take many forms, including cash payments, investment in social programs, trust funds, an official apology, right? Institutional reform, public education about slavery and racial discrimination. That's huge. I think we have a under-education in this country about our past. So that would be important. Representative James Clyburn has argued against reparations taking the form of cash payments on the grounds that it would be logistically difficult to carry out. Instead, he and many other policymakers support investing in impoverished communities as a form of reparations. Critics of reparations programs that focus on these broad-based social programs, however, argue that they cannot be considered reparations if they don't specifically and solely target African Americans, right? Some may be opposed to cash reparations payments under the misguided assumption that African Americans cannot be trusted to spend cash payments in ways that will benefit them economically. And while this assumption is unsubstantiated and potentially rooted in racial bias and paternalism, as Professor Craemer pointed out, researchers have demonstrated that policymakers should be cautious about cash payments for another reason. And the reason is, it's possible that cash reparations payments could further impoverish Black Americans relative to non-Black Americans if there are no available vehicles to invest that money back into Black communities. So given that Black Americans own less than 10% of all small businesses in the US and hold less than 15% of their wealth in business investments, cash reparations payments in the current environment would most likely find their way back into the pockets of non-Black Americans, both through consumption spending and through investments held in mainstream financial institutions, potentially further widening the racial wealth divide. This, however, is not a reason against cash reparations payment, but rather an acknowledgement that any cash reparations payment should be coupled with the development of an investment infrastructure that could provide opportunities for recipients to invest in Black communities and Black-owned businesses, and to create Black-owned financial institutions if they so choose, right? That's important too, that there's agency in this, but that those vehicles should be available, and that infrastructure we need to be building now, right? Okay. Ultimately, the form a reparations program should take depends on the underlying goals. If the goal is to address the wealth gap created by discriminatory government actions like redlining and Jim Crow, cash payments or trust funds for investment in housing, education, or businesses may be the most appropriate form. If the goal is to repair or make whole those who were disadvantaged by the legacy of slavery and discrimination, an official apology and a program of public education about slavery and discrimination, and investment in social programs targeted at reducing racial disparities may be the most effective forms. If the goal is to address ongoing discrimination against African Americans, institutional reform may be in order, right? And these don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? As a final note, I'd like to address ongoing discrimination in this country. Even if policymakers do not incorporate the damages from ongoing discrimination into the calculation of a reparations program, no reparations program will be complete without somehow addressing the existence of that ongoing discrimination. As long as institutional discrimination persists, there will be continued grounds for future reparations claims. I'm going to provide an example. As an example, Nathan Rosenberg and Bryce Duque penned an article in The New Food Economy, which is now called The Counter, where they identified ongoing discrimination at the US Department of Agriculture against Black farmers that has contributed to unjust foreclosures. Among other findings, they report that the department under the administration of George W. Bush sat on civil rights complaints that alleged lending discrimination until the statute of limitations on those complaints ran out, right? Then officials in the Obama administration did not seek extensions from Congress on the statute of limitations, right? So there's no political party that has a monopoly on this. Instead they actively foreclosed on Black farmers who had pending lending discrimination complaints. So even if the descendants of Black farmers were made whole for the loss of Black agricultural land during the Jim Crow era, future generations would have claims for reparations based on the documented ongoing discrimination by the USDA. To guard against this particular instance of discrimination, Congress should enact legislation that prevents any arm of government that's accused of discrimination from failing to act on that discrimination until the statute of limitations run out, right? There are ways to fix these loopholes. And so there are certainly other instances of government agencies using loopholes to get around civil rights protections meant to guard against ongoing discrimination. Any reparations program should also establish a commission to examine structural discrimination within federal, state, and local government policies and practices, and propose institutional reforms that reinforce civil rights protections to guard against the need for future redress. To conclude, in conceptualizing a reparations program for African Americans, policymakers should establish the basis for which reparations are owed, whether it's slavery, the period of state-sanctioned discrimination, and/or ongoing institutional discrimination. 2, they should determine the goal of a reparations program. Is it to make whole those who were wronged, to close racial wealth gaps, and/or to address ongoing discrimination? They should create a commission to estimate the value to be set aside for a reparations program. They should decide the appropriate form a reparations payment should take, and they should incorporate a plan to address ongoing discrimination. And that's it, I'll conclude there.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Francis. That was really wonderful. We are all so excited to now engage in a short discussion with you both and hopefully tease out a little bit more about both of your proposals for really getting at this issue of the economics of reparations. I'm going to start with Professor Francis just to build off of a couple of points that you just mentioned. So in your article, The Economics of Reparations, you highlight the connection between structure and efficacy. And you started to touch upon how you would structure a reparations program and specifically how you would address the Black-white economic gap in the United States. So I'm curious, given your background in stratification economics, how can that be employed in a reparations program to mobilize equitable economic redress for Black Americans and create sustainable infrastructure so that it actually spurs these intergenerational benefits? What sorts of investment vehicles are we looking at?
That's a great question. So first, let me, I'll briefly explain stratification economics for anyone unfamiliar. So the goal of stratification economics is to explain intergroup disparities, right? Where groups can be defined along many dimensions, right? Race, gender, class, sexual orientation, right? And so what distinguishes stratification economics from, sort of traditional microeconomic theory is moving beyond this typical rational, self-interested, utility maximizing individual, right? That most economic models incorporate, to add this aspect of group identity, right? And so in that way, stratification economics really integrates economics, sociology, and to some sense social psychology, right? And so in the current context that we're discussing, if we're looking to explain, for example, Black-white wealth gaps, right? Traditional economic analysis would point to individual behaviors as the reason, right? Are Blacks not investing as much? Are they not saving as much? Are they not as financially literate, right? Like these individual behavioral reasons as a cause of Black-white wealth gaps, and therefore the behavior to be targeted as the solution, right? But rather stratification economics says, let's take a more structural, historical, and holistic approach, right? And also incorporate things like differential access to intergenerational wealth, right? As the result of past discrimination. And so solutions that focus just on behavior, right, will not close the gap, right? And rather instead something like a wealth transfer, right? Along the same magnitude of the wealth transfers that have been historically bestowed upon whites in the US through these discriminatory policies would be necessary. And so to relate it to the reparations program, that's part of the argument, I think, that Darity and Mullen make in this notion that, the most comprehensive way to address historical discrimination is through the wealth gaps that it's opened up intergenerationally, right? And the way to do that, if you do it through something like cash payments or cash transfer, would be to have community development organizations, banking apparatus that is focused on investment in Black communities instead of, right, the sort of historic discriminatory relationship Blacks have had with the financial infrastructure.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful to understand. And I'm still trying to understand stratification economics myself. So this is really, really a great primer. Thank you so much. My next question is for Professor Craemer. I wanted to talk a little bit about your article, Estimating Slavery Reparations, Present Value Comparisons of Historical Multi-Generational Reparations Policies. In your article, you say that you support for slavery reparations, that support for slavery reparations might increase if enslaved people's contributions to the US economy were better understood. So what is the most effective and efficient way to further this outcome?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure if I know an answer to it, but I would say education is key. And that should begin in high school education, like I went through with education about the Holocaust in Germany. I think education is very superficial about slavery in this country at this point. So a much more thoughtful way of presenting this historical information to children would be important. But I could imagine that also like a calculation, kind of back of the envelope calculation, like I showed, with just taking puny amounts of cents and adding up all the hours and then multiplying and ending up with trillions of dollars. That's just, it's just an intuitive, it gives an intuitive sense of the sheer order of magnitude of the injustice. Yeah, it illustrates basically what was lost to African Americans. And so that might be helpful as well. Yeah, as I said, education is key in this.
Right. Yes. Thank you. I mean, it was definitely very, I think, shocking to a lot of us in the audience just to get so close to those numbers and really get into the minute sense and how that, you know, really does add up, because you hear these large numbers and it becomes a little harder to really understand the individual and sort of accumulative value that represents. So thank you. You know, this next question is for both of you, and feel free if you have a response to just interject. Since the Reconstruction era, reparations have been a part of the public discourse around how to remedy the egregious harm of American slavery, but have not been achieved. You know, clearly we have seen, you know, many attempts to argue for reparations, and finally, you know, this conversation has really become more mainstream. And this is somewhat of a controversial question, but, you know, should the reparations movement rebrand? You know, what are some of the sort of critiques that you find persuasive about reparations, and then how do you respond? It's sort of a two-part question.
So I can jump in. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that's right. There's, you know, I did mention, right, there's been these sort of ebbs and flows over time, and it is remarkable to see how much interest there is currently, and how much momentum I think there is currently. And so I do not think that that reparations needs rebranding, but I think that right, there is the critique that in these divided times, it seems, you know, highly politically infeasible that a reparations program would make it through our federal legislation apparatus. But we've addressed hard problems before, right? We've you know, the civil rights movement was a prime example, and so things probably looked bleak and impossible at that juncture, and yet continuing to mobilize and to educate and to build coalitions, I think was the way to get that done, and it's the way to go here. So I don't think it needs a rebranding. I do think that if we keep up momentum in education, that's a positive way to go.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly support everything you just said. I also don't think it needs rebranding. I think the idea is unpopular, but technically it's an idea that has appeal on both sides of the ideological divide. And that's often forgotten, that one of the earliest calls for cash reparations came from Charles Krauthammer, who was a conservative commentator. He was skeptical of affirmative action, and instead said, well, all conservatives can agree that slavery was wrong and that wrongs must be set right. And he recommended a lump sum cash payment. So there is a conservative way to argue for reparations, and there's a liberal way of arguing for reparations. So the two camps aren't too far apart. It's not the typical program that conservatives so much hate, when you give money to everybody. That's why I also think that these programs that give money to the poor in general are probably not popular among conservatives, but also not really reparations, because, as you said earlier, that they don't target the actual people that suffered or their direct descendants. So I think there can be an argument made that would appeal to both sides of the divide. But of course, right now, the divide has shifted under the Trump era, so conservatism is no longer what it used to be. I'm not sure how Krauthammer would feel about this today, so I don't know how it's working out today.
Definitely. Thank you. You know, that was going to be my next question, really, was trying to tease through a little bit about the political climate that we're sort of, you know, trying to grapple with as we continue to move forward in this movement for reparations. And, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts, either of you have any additional thoughts on our current political climate and what might be potential ways to get back to this idea that this is not a conversation that should be held on two different party lines, but this really is a question more of, say, the economy. This to me sounds like a GDP question based off of both of your presentations. There's a large component that is economic, and of course there is a large component that is historical and personal and deeply troubling in our country's history. So, are there any strategies for ways to get this past sort of these political ideological divides, and along with that, what would be your suggestions for how to best fund these programs? I think tied into that question is always this question of how are you going to fund it. So if either of you could speak a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah. So I won't wade into political science since I'm not a political scientist, but I will say that in thinking of how I might advocate even in this climate is to appeal to the sense of this the economic sense of this sort of balance, right? Inequality cost, right? Inequality is costly. And if we only give attention to the part of the argument that says, oh, you're spending, you're trying to spend more money or give more money, or it's a giving thing, instead of focusing on the cost of income inequality in the US, racial inequality and wealth inequality, then we're not seeing the whole picture. And so I think part of it is to use the research that's out there, right? There's lots of research demonstrating how costly inequality is. One of my favorite papers is by Lisa Cook, who shows just how much economic value was lost by discrimination in patenting against African-American inventors, right? So if we, address discrimination, racial discrimination, and demonstrate that sort of value, I think that can convince people who aren't convinced by the moral arguments, right? I think there's a moral argument to be made, but if you're not convinced by the moral arguments, we can also put forth the right information about how costly it is to have these inequalities.
And I think a powerful moral argument that would appeal also on the conservative side is we are used to paying outstanding debts, and African Americans provided the startup capital for the United States economy, and we all benefit from that generations later, and so we all have a responsibility to pay back that debt. I think that's also an important conservative idea.
Thank you. Yes, this question of debt, just like you mentioned with Haiti, our group did a research project where we sort of were astounded by this incredible debt that France imposed on Haiti. And it to me seems like a very similar comparison. We have a whole group of Black Americans who are disenfranchised and a debt is owed. So how do we go about doing this? Thank you both so much. I know there are some audience questions, so I don't want to delay too much. I will turn to those audience questions now, and then if we have time for more further questions for me, then I can give them to Jocelyn. But in the meantime, I will hand this over to my co-moderator, Jocelyn, who will handle the audience Q&A portion. Thank you both so much for being here. We're really grateful.
Yes, just to echo Magali and also the audience members in the chat, thank you so much for being here. This has been a great discussion so far, and we have some really great questions as well. So the first one is for you, Professor Craemer. This audience member asks how you would compare your reparations proposals to the Article 2 fund, which provided reparations to the families of Holocaust survivors. One shortcoming of that program was the scope. And there were many descendants of the Holocaust here in the United States who do not receive those payments. So how could a US program compensate for some of those shortcomings in the other program?
That's a great question. And actually, I think the German reparations program should not be a model for the American reparations program. I would say a much better model is the Japanese-American World War II internment reparations, because it went along with a letter of apology. While that was missing in the German example, instead, survivors of the Holocaust, like my friend Mircu, had to go through a humiliating application process and prove the harm it was staggered by how much harm you had in medical needs and whatnot, based on what you had to prove. And that is already in no formal letter of apology. So it was a symbolic financial gesture, but I think it was clumsily distributed. And of course, it was sparing. It was small payments, and many people were excluded. I know that, for example, these days, even people in Greece are suing Germany for reparations, and Germany is saying no, based on no logical, I mean, there were victims of World War II / the Holocaust. So I agree. And if there are survivors in the United States who are not receiving reparations, I think this is definitely a situation that needs a remedy. And when the negotiations were done in 1952, one important point that Israel insisted on was that Germany institute legislation that was open-ended and ongoing to compensate victims of the Holocaust. And that was instituted, so those laws are in place, but they're far from perfect. So it's not a perfect model to follow. It's just one of the earliest models, or if not the earliest model.
Thank you so much. This next question is for the both of you. One audience member asks, where is this money coming from? Will Black Americans and other minorities be exempt from having to contribute to funding reparations?
Yeah, I think we can, that's a great question. And I think Magali did ask that, and I didn't fully answer her. So, that's important. There are, we've shown, right, over the past year that we know how to raise funds when needed with the coronavirus pandemic. But this is an important question. Absolutely, recipients of reparations in the US should not also be funding, right, reparations. And so if reparations were raised through a tax program, that should be a tax that those who are deemed recipients of reparations would be exempt from. Should there be an income tax? Should it be a wealth tax? It makes more sense to me that it should be a wealth tax, especially if we're talking about reparations as a way to close wealth gaps. But I do agree that those who are eligible for reparations should not be paying into the fund for reparations.
I have a slightly different approach in my paper, but the result will be the same. But the approach I took was technically it's the federal government that allowed slavery to exist, and therefore the federal government is responsible. And today the federal government is all of us, and including me as a recent immigrant, but also including African Americans, and everybody indirectly benefits from the startup capital that slavery provided the US economy. So the idea was that what I calculated was what if everybody paid for reparations, and I came up with a sum of, I don't know if it was $60,000 or something like that. And then what would African Americans, descendants of the enslaved, receive? And that was like, I don't know, I don't remember exactly, but $450,000 or something like that. And then I subtracted what the amount that recipients would receive minus the amount they would have to pay, and that gives the net amount of reparations, which was like these $397,000 that I came up with. So that this back of the envelope calculation just assumes that everybody pays, but that may not be the way the federal government ends up financing this, because there is plenty of companies that benefited from slavery left over in the United States. There are estates that were accumulated through slave labor that are still handed from one generation to the next in white hands. And these could be taxed with near 100%, and or it could be taxed to the proportion that they were made up of slave labor, and that could be transferred to that fund to fund the reparations program. So there could be various models. I think it's important that they make, you know, in order to get back to this question about political support, it's important that they make logical sense to people. That you know, that I did an experimental survey where I asked people different questions about slavery reparations, and when I asked whether companies that benefited from slave labor should pay, support was much higher than when I asked whether white people should pay, because the connection wasn't clear enough. It had, you know, when I said white heirs of estates that were accumulated through slave labor, then the support was higher. So there has to be a logical connection in people's minds to the injustice of slavery and later racial discrimination.
Thank you so much to both of you for that answer. And that definitely makes sense in thinking about, you know, building coalition. It has to make sense, our justifications for reparations, or else it won't succeed. We need broad support. So thank you so much. We have another audience question going back to your calculation, Professor Craemer. This person asks, if you could review why the 24 hours is the most appropriate base for the wage-based model as opposed to the 12 hours.
Yes, the 12 hours basically means that this was the time during which the enslaved worked for cash crop production and therefore produced wealth for the enslavers, whereas the rest of the day was basically a cost factor for the enslavers. And so reparations based on the price-based method basically say there has to be, you know, you have to subtract that wage that slaves received in form of housing, food, and time off from the overall bill. And I was trying to find a method to look at it from the perspective of the enslaved, because what we are applying here is economic notions from free market economics, where the assumption is always that people are free agents and they negotiate with each other and then they find the best price. But when the price of a slave was negotiated, it was between two slave owners. The slave had no say in it. And so I was trying to revive what the perspective of the enslaved was. And I was thinking the best way is to go back what they would have charged to be on call for the entire day. And the conservative assumption is they would have charged what free laborers at the time charged. But they probably would have charged even more for nighttime hours, because, you know, that's overtime. But I did not apply those notions. So I would say it's actually quite conservative to go with 24 hours. 12 hours seems to be not to capture the perspective of the enslaved and the control they had over their day, or did not have over their day.
Thank you. And this question is for both of you, and bear with me, it's a little technical, but given that reparations can take many forms, how do you both think about decentralized currencies and cryptocurrency? And for example, Bitcoin, there are numerous methods for microlending where you can have communities use cryptocurrency as an investment tool and exchange value or store value without institutional intermediaries. So do you think this is a viable way to close the white-black wealth gap?
I have to go on record as saying I am woefully ignorant about cryptocurrencies. And so my best response here will be to be honest about my ignorance and say that that's a good question and one that I can't answer for you right now.
I was hoping I could shift this over to you because I'm also ignorant about cryptocurrencies. So I can't give an answer to that question, although I think it's an excellent question. But yeah, no.
Thank you both for your honesty, and also thank you. That's a great question and one we in BLSA can look into further. This is for both of you as well. Can you speak on universities and educational institutions who have profited from slavery and how they engage in reparations for Black students today? I believe Brown University students recently voted in favor of students who descended from slaves to receive reparations. And also Georgetown did something similar. So could you share your thoughts on those types of reparations programs?
Do you want to go first, or? Okay, yeah, I've been working with a group of direct descendants of the Georgetown 272, the GU 272 Isaac Hawkins Legacy Group, and I've been consulting with them. So I know a little more about Georgetown University's approach. First of all, I have to say that I'm totally impressed with the fact that an institution that was involved in slavery addresses this head on and apologizes for it, renames buildings, and does a lot of other projects that I would call symbolic, but those are very important symbols. That's exactly what was missing in the German example. So acknowledging the responsibility out front and apologizing and then renaming. The problem is that the descendants of the GU 272 felt left out financially, although reparations were promised. The university viewed those, would initially propose to use the funds to move them from one budget in the university to another to start a institute to study slavery. And it's a great idea. I think that's what a university should do anyway, but I wouldn't call it reparations. So reparations to me would mean it would have to go directly to the descendants for them to make the decision about how it is spent. So in Georgetown, also the students voted to impose a fee on themselves. It was a symbolic fee of $27.20 per semester to go to the direct descendants. Unfortunately, it was a non-binding vote, and as far as I know, the university decided not to institute the fee. But now, just a few days ago, the Jesuits of Canada and the United States just announced that they started a 100 million or billion, I don't know, million probably, fund. I don't have my notes with me right now, but a fund anyway for reparations for the direct descendants of those that the Jesuits owned, and that would include the GU 272. So there is definitely discussions, and there was an acknowledgement that reparations are important. It's just unclear what reparations mean. They mean different things to different people. And I would also say that these local, the organizational and then locals, Asheville, North Carolina, or Evanston, Illinois also passed reparations, or then California passed a version of HR 40 on the state level. All these are very important projects to move the national discussion ahead, but ultimately it will have to be a federal program to make sense, because both slavery as well as discrimination under the New Deal were federal programs, and therefore should be repaired at the federal level, in my humble opinion.
That's right. I wholeheartedly agree, right? I think that the energy is in the right place, right? The energy with, what Brown is doing, Georgetown, Evanston, Asheville, that's a positive direction, but I also would hesitate to label it as reparations in the sense of a national reparations movement and program. And I do think that any well-conceived reparations program has to be, I agree, at the national level, in part because of the federal government's involvement in the initial harm, but also because the scale, right? The scale is so large that that it has to involve federal backing. And so, so long as these educational institutions, the local jurisdictions, so long as their efforts don't detract from a larger sort of national movement, I say that they're great, and continue with that positive energy. But I would not say, oh, look, you're in Evanston, you got some reparations, right? We're handling it piecemeal, because I don't think that would work.
Thank you both. Our next question says, is it not uncommon to subtract from recoveries for wrongs benefits that the victim has obtained from other sources? Should there be reductions for those who have benefited from affirmative action, for example, that would increase the recovery for working class and poor Blacks?
I would be careful, because affirmative action was not a program specifically for Black descendants of the enslaved. It was for everybody, women, Hispanics, anybody who was discriminated against before. So I would not subtract benefits that from policies that were directed at larger groups or at everybody.
I agree. And I think that's part of the appeal of basing a reparations payment on the wealth gap as well, because it possibly gets you away from some of that accounting if you argue that the wealth gap kind of encompasses benefits and wrongs, right? And I guess the other point I would make on that is that it becomes very difficult if you start down that path, right? Because there were certainly programs that disproportionately benefit, whites in the U.S., like even the Homestead Act, right? Giving land and things like that, right? So what do you qualify as something that was beneficial to Blacks in a way that it wasn't more beneficial to another group? So that I think that just becomes it becomes complicated, and that's why we advise that type of accounting.
Related to this discussion of the wealth gap, how would you respond to people who say that reparations will only increase the racial divide in the U.S.?
I mean, I don't think it has to, right? I think that part of the main issue is an education issue, right? And if a reparations program is not coupled with really a national effort at education about our history, about the current state of race in the U.S., then yes, right? It would seem like, what is this? Why is this one more thing that Blacks are getting, if you think Blacks are getting anything, right, in this country, right? And so, but I think that underscores really the importance of highlighting the cost of inequality, highlighting the history of inequality in the U.S. In a way that, again, is not currently done in our education system.
And I would also point to the German example of Holocaust reparations. It has not led to adverse relationships between Germany and Israel. Quite to the contrary, it has actually allowed an adverse relationship to heal or to be repaired. So in that sense, the term reparation actually makes sense, because these two countries are getting along very well today, and there was no prospect of that after, of course, the Holocaust. You couldn't possibly imagine that these two countries would ever speak to each other again. So I think reparations can bring people together.
Thank you. I certainly hope so. Our next question is about just thinking about proof and, who identifies as Black, especially as, people might be incentivized to all of a sudden identify as Black if there's a reparations program. But kind of on the opposite end, are there sufficient records for African Americans to prove that at least one of their ancestors was enslaved? Should there be a presumption that African Americans are descendants of enslaved people, with the government bearing the burden to disprove?
That's a great question. So I have a couple thoughts. As far as the burden of proof, so I think that there are sufficient records to get most people to a particular point, right? Census records and going back. If at some point it becomes slightly murky in your particular genealogy, I think that's when you should be given the benefit of the doubt, right? I think that we should err on the side of inclusion instead of exclusion, much like Professor Craemer was saying in the example of reparations for the Holocaust, like forcing people to jump through hoops can seem antithetical to what we were trying to do. So in that vein, I also think that there is an important socioeconomic component there, and it may be much easier for someone with more economic means to trace back their ancestry, right? You pay $50 a month on some of these sites and you get access to records that others don't have access to, and so on and so forth. And so a part of a reparations program should take that into account, and there should be, the government should subsidize the efforts for those who can't afford to trace their genealogy back. But I think that, again, like we should err on the side of inclusion. I think that there will be far fewer people who all of a sudden claim to be Black than we maybe imagine. But also that is a reason to impose the eligibility requirement that you have at some point 10 years prior to, or sometime prior to a reparations program, you've self-identified yourself as Black on some official form or something like that.
Yeah, I could even imagine a family tree restoration project as one reparations measure that the government could entertain, because the government has the census records, the government has archives that have deeds. So there's a lot of information, and the government could simply employ genealogists, as the French government did when it tried to find out who's eligible for the recipients of the Haitian independence debt. Those were also archivists and genealogists. And also in the Georgetown example, it was actually a Georgetown alum, Richard Cellini, who collected money from among alums, from alumni, to fund, I think, eight genealogists that professionally traced the descendants of the GU 272. So similar programs could be established, and I think that would serve a double function. One, it would establish eligibility, but on the other hand, it would also restore a lot of information, make it publicly available, be a great resource for research and for individual families, and restore some of what was lost systematically by slavery, destroying that ancestral knowledge.
Right, and that's reparative, right? And restorative in a sense as well. That's right.
Yes, absolutely. This panel, we're focusing on the economics, but also the implementation of reparations. So what would you say are the major challenges to implementing a reparations program besides the politics, as we mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a logistical uphill battle, but again, not one that we're not at the level that we're unused to having done at some point before, right? It's not impossible. I think that there are nuances, regarding eligibility, regarding the way to raise the funds that are important to talk through. But right, we also have brilliant minds in this country that are used to doing minute policy and legal issues. And so I think it's challenging, but not a challenge that we can't tackle and overcome.
Yeah, and I would agree, especially a moonfaring nation is used to tackling complicated questions. I think the logistics themselves of actually getting the reparations money to the recipients and based on eligibility criteria should not be too great. We just saw it in the COVID-19 stimulus packages, that the money was given based on your income level, graded, and that was a bureaucratic effort that was doable. So I would imagine that that could work very similarly to that.
Yes, absolutely. And earlier, Professor Craemer, you said that descendants of slaves should be the ones leading the reparations movement and making some of those logistical decisions. But Black Americans are diverse. And so will a successful reparations movement require a unified African-American coalition? And if so, how do we go about achieving that? And this is for both of you.
That's a good question, and I'm not sure. Can you go first?
Yeah, I can. No, I think that's an excellent question, and I think I'll invoke the example of Callie House that Professor Craemer brought up earlier, right? So Callie House was a formerly enslaved woman who was she existed in poverty for the majority of her life, and she was a washerwoman, but she advocated for old age pensions for the formerly enslaved, right? And so she was saying, look, I'm not asking for handouts. What I'm saying is, here are people who can no longer work, right? They did not have the luxury of working for a company that would give them a pension now. They can't work to support themselves. Like, government, will you please support these formerly enslaved people who cannot work, right? And support themselves. In part of her efforts, she reached out to what would be the sort of political Black elite at the time, and was kind of told, we're fighting larger battles here, battles for equality, and her argument was, yes, but people are dying because they can't eat, right? So certainly we've seen examples in the past of what happens when the interest of maybe the masses are not fully represented by those who have political agency, and that's I think a cautionary tale to make sure that multiple voices are included in these conversations. This is not something that should be planned and implemented only by those academics like me, or right, but that there should be large grassroots efforts, of which there are, right? There, that is happening now, and those are voices that are important and should be incorporated and listened to.
The example of Callie House that you just explained also brings me back to a somewhat different thought, if I may interject that, to say how you can build support in the general population for reparations and make it politically more feasible. She had support of Frederick Douglass, who led the African-American movement at the time, but she also had support from people like Edmund Pettus, who was a Democratic, Southern Democrat, racist Ku Klux Klan member, ex-Confederate. And why on earth would he actually support introducing her bill into the Senate? And it was because he viewed ex-slave pensions as a stimulus package for the Southern economy that was at the bottom. So he hoped that it would revive the economy overall. And an argument like that could actually bring some, some opponents around in today's climate to say there is also a stimulating effect of reparations for the overall economy. I don't think that should be the main argument, but it may have that effect. And in Germany too, reparations stimulated the German economy, so it was not a net loss.
Thank you. And I'll just close us out with one last question. We've talked about several avenues for reparations and also the unsettled questions. Do you think that HR 40 can settle these questions? And say HR 40 is passed, how would you recommend that that commission to study reparations be structured?
I have to admit that I'm very concerned about HR 40 because who appoints the commission, and especially how is it ensured that is exactly that question that we just discussed, that the voices of the diverse voices of the descendant community are heard. I'm also concerned that it does not provide for reparations, although back when it was first introduced in 1989, there was not a lot of research done. Richard F. America hadn't published his book yet. By now, a lot of research has been done. And so in a way, it would be time to actually pay out reparations, at least an initial payment, and then study further payments and further strategies. So I'm concerned that the commission could become a vehicle for postponing reparations further and to let's deliberate longer. And I think it's time for reparations now.
I agree with that. I think maybe one positive thing is that right, in all the years that HR 40 had been introduced before, it hadn't gotten even this much consideration, right? And when you think about what HR 40 was asking, was just it wasn't asking for reparations, right? Can we get some money to study reparations? And it couldn't even get out of the gate. So so I think this is progress, but I also agree. I think that we have studied, right? in this intervening time period, we have done a lot of studying, and I think now it's time to think about legislation. I was excited to hear about you guys crafting right, with model legislation, and that there are minds at work, right, at this, and I think that is to be encouraged. And I agree, it's time for action.
Well, I think that is a perfect note to close on. And I would just like to thank you both so much for joining us. And thank you, Magali, for moderating the first portion of our discussion. This has been really enriching and engaging. We appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. We cannot thank you enough. So we really appreciate you, Professor Craemer and Professor Francis. And as Professor Francis just mentioned, BLSA is finalizing model reparations legislation, and we will be sharing the recording of this session as well as our first session, our first panel in the comprehensive reparations series in our forthcoming Reparations Resource Center. So stay tuned. BLSA has a lot in the works on reparation, and we really hope to further this discussion on reparations and really get the ball moving. So thank you both so much, and I'll turn it over to Magali to give some final thanks.
Thank you all so much. I really can't add much to that ending. That was really great. I do think there is a lot of hope, and it's time to implement reparations. That's my main takeaway. So I just want to thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for putting this together and organizing our BLSA's advocacy work and reparations, pathway forward, we're really excited to continue to work on this. So with that, thank you all so much. Thank you to the attendees for joining us for an hour and a half. And we really appreciate you taking the Friday evening to join us. So thank you all so much. And we hope to stay connected.
Take care, everyone.